Well, we turn back to God's Word in Genesis chapter 11, and we can read again at verse 5. Genesis 11 and verse 5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, if as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. Remember that before the flood, the world was in utter chaos. Evil and wickedness prevailed as men and women sought to gratify their own illegitimate desires and disregard God. But then this man Noah finds favor with God, and he was used to abolish this evil as the world was wiped out through the flood. 1 year and 10 days they were on board this ark. Noah and his 7 other family members they were on the ark before they were able to disembark. And as soon as they did come off, there was peace. There was worship. There was praise. Because Noah remembered God. Yet we're not even 3 chapters on, and it seems that the world is as evil, if not worse, than it was before the flood. And though man continually fails God, and man does continually fail God, this is the story of the Old Testament. This is the story of history. Man continually fails God, but God never fails man. We have re-entered into the spiral of sin. And we turn here to Genesis chapter 11, the end of primeval history, and we read of Noah's descendants being fueled with pride and seeking to go it alone without any help from God Almighty. I just want to look at 2 main points: the sovereignty of man and the sovereignty of God. But within these points, I want to notice 4 sub-points, in both of the same ones in both headings. I want to see language, land, plan, and name. Language, land, plan, and name. The same in both of our points. So first, in the sovereignty of man, we see language in verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. I think it's quite hard for us to try and imagine, try to comprehend a world with just one language. We can't even drive to Inverness without seeing 2 languages on the road signs. But here in Shinar, everybody could understand everybody. There were no language barriers, no need for translators. You could go on your holidays knowing that whoever you spoke to would understand what you were saying. Of course, there would have been various benefits to only having one language. It would be less hassle. Travel would be more straightforward. And from a Christian point of view, we could go to any people group in the world and language would not be a barrier. So there would have been potential positives. But this is where God is wiser. God is more sovereign than we are. Because He foresees, as we read in particular in verse 6, He foresees that if mankind is left to themselves, then they will revolt against Him. The 8 that exited the ark, it didn't take them long to turn their back on God. It didn't take Noah long to turn away from the promises and the covenant that God made and to become a drunkard. Humanity had been told to spread out across the whole world, but instead they congregated and were beginning to form their own parliaments. And how long do we think that it would have taken them to have made a policy in one language over this one people, covering the whole of humanity, to eradicate the worship of Yahweh? Was this not what they were trying to do in Babel? This one language. But we see, secondly, their land in verse 2. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there. This all harks back and should maybe trigger something in our minds from Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, in regards to Noah. When he makes this promise, this covenant with them, he says, God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. And that statement is a reiteration of the initial blessing to Adam when he was in the Garden of Eden in chapter 1 of Genesis. Go, be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the whole earth. But now he is having to say it again because sin has spread violently amongst humanity. God had instructed Noah's family, his descendants, to go, populate the earth, north, south, east, west. But instead they disobey God. They congregate in one location to build one great and majestic city. Now, building the city in and of itself was not wrong. But what was wrong was their motivation to building this city. Because they could build it themselves. They could build this wonderful city for them all to live in, this wonderful habitat. And they don't need God. They could do it without God. Or so they thought. They could create their own God, who they believed would be more powerful than Yahweh. There's something very interesting which I discovered in regards to them moving eastward. And they settle in the plains of Shinar. You see that in verse 2. But there's at least three other examples, I'm sure many more. Adam and Eve, when they sinned in the Garden of Eden, they were punished. And they were banished from the garden. They were banished from God's presence. And where did they go? They traveled east of Eden. This was their judgment. Cain, in chapter 4, verse 16, he was also cast out of God's presence after murdering his brother. And he refused to follow God's instructions. And he went to dwell in the land east of Eden. And later in Genesis, we'll read that Lot will separate from Abraham. He moved toward the east. And we know where Lot ended up. Right in the very heart of the city of sexual immorality. The city of Sodom. The author of Genesis, Moses, is deliberately contrasting God's way of blessing with man's own attempt to do good. And biblically, when man goes east, he leaves the land of blessing, for example, Eden, the promised land, and he goes to the land where the greatest of his hopes will turn out for ruin, to the likes of Babylon, to Sodom. And so we see the land. But thirdly, they have a plan in the sovereignty of man. In verse 3 and 4. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This parliament takes their seats, this human council, and they begin their first session. Whichever side of the fence you fall on in regards to Brexit, it doesn't matter. But I think we'll all agree that it's gone on for a long time. I even heard these 3 16-year-old boys this week in the sports centre debating it and talking about it. They were not even old enough to vote in the referendum, and they have a lot of opinions about it. But the Babylonians wasted no time. They had their first session, they had their first parliament, they had their first human council. And we see there in verse 3, as they constituted as a council, they then said, "Come, let's make bricks and tar." And once they've done that, in verse 4, they say, "Come, let's build a city and a great tower." They just got the job done. And actually, it all sparked what's actually going on right now in my mind, because in Qatar right now, they're building their own city. They were awarded the FIFA World Cup for 2022, and Qatar is not largely populated, and it does not have many cities itself, but they made their pitch that they were going to build a city for the World Cup to come to Qatar. And they're going to do this in 8 years, and it's going to cost $45 billion. And let me quote the construction company that says that the city is going to be a luxury-oriented hub surrounded by the crystal-clear Gulf waters, home to dozens of brand-new neighbourhoods and whiz-bang infrastructural systems. In other words, it's going to be the best of the best. You can read all the details about it for yourselves, but one thing in particular caught my eye. They're going to build this 86,000-seater football stadium, which will have zero carbon footprint and will be entirely solar powered, and will employ a series of $500,000 devices called man-made clouds to shield it from the sun. Floating high over the stadium, these carbon fiber sun shields will be kept afloat by several solar powered motors. Is this for the glory of God or for the glory of man? We see what man can do when they put their minds together. It's not necessarily wrong, but we see what man can do. But here in Shinar, they put their minds together, and this is what they come up with, and we must give them credit, because on the surface it does look commendable. They didn't want to spread out into the unknown. They desired to create a city where their achievements of a united and integrated people would all be centralized. They were giving out the invitation for everybody to come. Let's join forces. Let's unite. What God could stand against us? We can create our own God. We can make our own way of life. And the central feature of the city was going to be this tower. And this tower was going to reach all the way to the heavens. Now, I don't think the people, maybe you can disagree, I don't think the people were foolish enough to believe that they could build a tower to such a height. Maybe they did. But were they foolish enough to build it on the plains of Shinar, which was almost at sea level, when they could have just gone onto a nearby mountain or hill and begin a few 100,000 or 1,000 feet higher and get a head start? But regardless, in the Hebrew text, the words to reach the heavens don't occur. The text actually speaks of the top of the tower being in, on, with, or by the heavens. So it could mean that the top of the tower was dedicated to the heavens as a place of worship. So some have suggested that on the top of the tower they would have carved a figure of a god, like zodiac, on the top of the tower, and it been presented up to the heavens. They wanted to build this great, majestic tower to be the central feature of their town, of their city. They wanted to show off what man could do. And fourthly, they wanted to make a name for themselves. And it all ties together They wanted to build this extravagant city and this extravagant tower to put their names down in history. These lads who I couldn't help but overhear in the sports centre, they were having various conversations in this 1 hour, and I should have intervened at one point because they were discussing very briefly life and death. One of the boys was saying that it doesn't matter if you're remembered or not after you die. He just thought and he believed that if you just go through your life, try to do good things, make an impact in your community, then that's what matters. But the other boy was having none of it. And he was saying that after 2 or 3 or 4 generations, you're forgotten. Apart from those who have made a name for themselves. And he started listing politicians, Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill. And Donald Trump will be remembered for various reasons. But not these men of Genesis 11. They were not satisfied to be forgotten after a few generations. They wanted to be on the map. They wanted their names to be etched onto the minds of all the generations of the future. And so they come up with this method. They were going to use bricks, not stone, and tar instead of mortar. They were going to do innovative ideas of burning the bricks thoroughly, and so they'll last. So that this tower is going to stand, it's going to outlive us all. They wanted to build a civilization without God. They wanted independence from Him. They wanted to finally escape His wrath and His punishment. And they wanted to bow down, they wanted to create and bow down to their own gods. Gods who will accept the way that they live their life. Gods who will be happy in the way they conduct themselves. Their vision is to build this tower. This tower that was going to be grand and majestic enough to overcome the people's knowledge of Yahweh. Because it was God who commanded them to scatter abroad. And if they build this tower, presented it as their own God, then it will forget about Yahweh. Forget what He's done. Forget what He's said. But Romans 1:23 speaks about when people turn from God, they turn to false religion. The Bible traces all false religion back to Babel, to Babylon. In Revelation 17:5, it's deep when it speaks about this woman who has on her forehead this message says, "Mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth." Not a place you want to go to. Not a place that is spoken well of in the Bible. The sovereignty of man. But turn from man to the sovereignty of God. And we'll consider the subpoints in reverse order. Name, plan, land, and language. But before we even come to the first point, you must notice verse 5, which we read. This section of the Tower of Babel from verse 1 to 9, it's actually in a chiasm. They're almost symmetrical. Our Old Testament lecturers would love this. The reader is intended to notice. There's different features that I won't bore you with, but what is at the very heart of this chiasm from verse 1 to 9 is verse 5. And this is the thrust of this passage. You find it in verse 5 saying, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower." What's so interesting about that? Well, this great masterpiece, this high tower, this work of art that the men have made all by themselves. This is the pinnacle of man's creation. It is so lofty, it's so grand, it's beautiful, it's going to be their God, it's going to be used by their God, it's going to be used for them to worship, and yet Yahweh has to stoop down even to see it. Of course, this is an anthropomorphism. That is God being described as if He were a man. And of course God sees everything, but the author is making the point that even the best of man's efforts are nothing compared to God's. This is the tower that was said to reach heaven, and yet the God of heaven has to come down. He has to stoop down to even see it. To give a flawed illustration, it's like when you see a colony of ants just working their way together, and one of them's got a wee leaf, the other one's got a wee twig, and then you see like 100 of them, and they've all got a wee leaf and a wee twig, and they're building this anthill, and you see, well, they're doing a really good job. They're putting all their effort together, and they're making this hill. You have to be pretty mean, but you realize that very easily you could destroy that whole anthill with one swing of your foot. Jameson Nass says that God always has to come down to examine the anthill achievements built in the pavement cracks of His creation. I stood at the bottom of the CN Tower in Toronto last year and couldn't fathom how tall it was. It's the third largest building in the world at 553 meters, but my brother couldn't even take a photo of me and the building in the same shot. It was that big. And yet when you get onto the plane and you take off and you circle the city and you're beginning to fly back, it's actually quite difficult to even spot the tower. It's hard to make it out. Our achievements pale into insignificance compared to God's achievements. What has He done? He's created the universe. God has become man. Jesus Christ coming into the womb of the Virgin Mary and been born and living His life in this world and dying for our sin and rising again and ascending to heaven. He is the Creator Himself. He is sovereign. Well, in regards to the sovereignty of God, let's go back to the subpoint of name in verse 9, and we can read. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the faces of the whole earth. These people wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to go down in history. Well, God gives them a name. He calls them Babel, the confused. He confused their languages. And Babel in itself, some have claimed that it means the gate of God, or perhaps more precisely, the gate of gods. In other words, false religion entered here. The Babylonians were, and we are, full of pride. Full of pride. So concerned about our reputations. What do others think of us? But what does God think of us? We say, look at what we've achieved. Look at what I've done. What does God see? And would He be pleased with the way that you conducted yourself this week? Did you boast in your own achievements? Or did you boast in the Lord? Maybe the boys were right. Maybe in a few generations we will largely be forgotten. But if you're a Christian, if you love the Lord, if you've given your life to Jesus Christ, your name is precious to Him. It's never going to be forgotten. How can I be so sure? Because your name is written in the book of life. Isaiah 49, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your name is written. Your name is remembered. Your name is precious. But there's also a plan. We see it in verse 7. This is God speaking. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. We noticed the human council assembling to erect this grand city, this grand tower. But here in verse 7 we read about the divine council. What is the divine council? Well, we see it. God is speaking to God. Here we have a hint towards the Trinity. The Father dialoguing with the Son and the Spirit. There has never been, and there never will be, a greater congress than this one, when the Godhead assembles. They make no mistakes. There is no fallouts. There can be no referendums. They communicate and they act. God was not in the Babylonians' worship, but Satan was. And the time to crush, as we've seen recently in Genesis 3:15, the time to crush Satan's head, which was prophesied, that time was still afar off. But in the meantime, God was going to crush this latest attempt of Satanism. He was not going to do it with fire. He promised he wasn't going to do it with a flood. So what was he going to do? Well, the divine council said that they would do it in the people's minds and in their vocal cords. He would confuse their languages. We need to make clear, God was not feeling threatened by the ingenuity of humanity. Rather, what God knew and what the city builders did not know was that the devastation that sin would wreak if human pride would allow just to progress unhindered. And when we reflect on the last 2 centuries, the 20th and this one, 21st century, we are reminded of how achievements in technology, along with the thousands upon thousands who have died in war, that bears witness to how much evil can be unleashed when the best minds in our countries, the brightest minds in the world, put and come together to build their own Babels. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Well, thirdly and fourthly, we see, take them together because they overlap, the land and the language. We've read most of verse 7 and to 9. The people's desire was to disobey God. They thought they knew better. Having one language was very efficient for them. They could communicate without any hindrances. Yet this wasn't the ways of God. In Isaiah chapter 55, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. Did God just confuse their languages, leaving the world with over 6,500 today just to punish them? Did God just scatter them far and wide from this wicked city just to curse them? Well, in one sense, yes, he did. But there's two sides to this coin. One side was that this was a curse. This was judgment. But on the other side, this was a blessing. This was a blessing for mankind. How is it a blessing? Well, God is sovereign. He is so wise. And here we see God's mercy poured out on this rebellious people. He gives understanding in spite of this language barrier. And even he promises that nations will once again worship together, presumably in one voice and with full understanding of each other. Not now. But we know that Pentecost is a fulfillment of that promise. The Babylonians, they wanted a city, but their city would never stand. If you've ever been to live events of sporting events or music concerts or even the Black Cow show, hundreds or thousands of people descend on this one location. And what always happens? There's queues, traffic jams, frustrations, there's trouble. These places, they're not equipped for that crowd. God will not allow them to live in Babel, but He does provide for them. He provides for this people, and He's provided for us. A city, the New Jerusalem, a city with foundations that will endure forever. The New Jerusalem will be prepared like a bride for her husband, and shall be golden. There shall be high walls. There shall be no temple there, but the tree of life will be in its very midst. And although it will be a city of incomparable beauty, the greatest thing about it is that the Lord will be there, and He will be with His people. Are you coming to the city of Jerusalem? Or are you going to continue building your Tower of Babel? Well, finally, spare me 2 minutes and let me show you the sovereignty of God in this passage as we take a wee step back. You'll notice that either side of this narrative there is a genealogy which stems from Noah. In chapter 10 it is a picture of unity gone well. All the nations come from this one family and they actually go and fill the earth. And chapter 11 is a picture of unity gone bad, where God judges mankind and He confuses their language. Yet there is amazing grace in all of this. That's why I wanted to read the last part of this chapter. Because in chapter 11 verse 10, you read there at the very beginning of that verse, this is the account of Shem, the chosen line from Noah's family. And his line proceeds, and you can read the list for yourself. But from verse 24, we read of Nahor. And Nahor fathered Terah, and Terah fathered Abram. And what's significant about that? What is significant about Abram? Well, we know that God changes his name to Abraham. What does Abraham mean? He's going to be the father of many nations. And God goes on to make a covenant with Abraham, promising that his name would be made great, that he's going to inherit a land, the promised land, that his seed would be as numerous as the stars of the sky, and that he would be blessed. And through him all nations will be blessed. And this is not random. The Bible is not random. God has a plan, and He has a plan for your life. He is sovereign. He is working all things together for good for those who love Him. He is prepared, and He is preparing this new Jerusalem. Are you coming to the city of Jerusalem? Or are you going to continue building your Tower of Babel? Amen. Well, let's conclude by singing in Psalm 135 in the Scottish Psalter. Psalm 135. We'll sing from the beginning. It's on page 425. Praise ye the Lord's name praise. His servants praise ye God, who stand in God's house, in the courts of our God make abode. Let's stand and sing to God's praise.
Praise ye the Lord's name praise. His servants praise ye God, who stand in God's house in the courts of our God.
may grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit rest and abide in each one of us, both now and forevermore. Amen.